Today's story is so intense it blurs the line between danger and destiny. Set in the Wild West, where rain turns dust into mud and mercy can cost you your life. This is a place where every choice matters, and where helping the wrong person can make you a target. It all began with a storm-torn road and a single act of compassion. Something small, almost human, yet powerful enough to summon violence, loyalty, and a love neither of them expected. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The storm did not simply arrive over High Mesquite Valley that night. It slammed down with the weight of molten iron, pounding the earth until the desert itself seemed to groan beneath it. Thorne Ashcroft pulled hard on his reins when he spotted the wreckage ahead. A wagon thrown on its side, wheels shattered like splintered bone, steam rising where rain met raw wood. Then he saw her, an Apache woman kneeling alone beside a body that no longer moved. Water weighed down her braids, and her hands shook as if the storm had ripped something vital from her chest. When she lifted her face toward him, a flash of lightning etched her grief into memory. "I'm all alone now," she whispered, a confession that struck a man who had spent years running from his own ghosts. Something hit Thorne deep enough to drive him from the saddle, even as instinct urged him to ride on. Dawn crept over High Mesquite Valley, dragging pale silver across the drenched land, as if the storm had scoured every trace of color away. Mesquite branches still dripped, heavy with the scent of wet smoke. Mud clung to Thorne's boots as he stepped away from the ruined wagon, the cold morning air cutting through the leftover heat of the night. A lone coyote cried beyond the low ridges, its voice thin and aching, as though it sensed the death the storm had left behind. This stretch of Arizona had always lived between worlds, ranchers pressing outward, drifters following cattle trails, and Apache families who had known the land long before fences carved it apart. Certain names were spoken in lowered voices, others were judged out loud. That truth lingered in the valley like dust that never fully settled. Zia stood apart from Thorne, her figure framed against a strip of bruised pink sky. Her buckskin dress clung to her legs, darkened by rain and grit. Long black hair, once tightly braided, now hung in damp strands around her shoulders. Even soaked in mud, she carried herself with quiet dignity, chin lifted, spine unbroken. Grief lay heavy across her face, yet her dark, watchful eyes held something Thorne could not name. Strength, perhaps, defiance, or simply a spirit that refused to fold after the world had taken everything from her. The storm had not weakened her. It had exposed her. Thorne told himself not to stare, yet his gaze kept drifting back. He noticed the small piece of hammered iron clenched in her left hand like a charm. He did not ask about it. The desert taught a man when to speak, and when silence was the kinder choice. He adjusted his coat, feeling the familiar pull of the scar along his ribs, a wound earned on a night he never spoke of. Years of drifting from ranch to ranch had shaped his body into lean strength, built from long rides, rough weather, and work done without complaint. A shadow of beard lined his jaw. His eyes carried the hollow fatigue of a man who had not slept well in years. Folks who met him always said the same thing. Thorne Ashcroft looked like someone who stayed only as long as he had to, then moved on before the world demanded anything of him. But that morning, something inside him felt uncertain. The valley smelled of wet clay and cold dawn. Smoke curled from the wagon's broken lantern, mixing with the sharp bite of iron. Above them, the clouds parted just enough to let sunlight slip through, casting a muted glow over two figures standing there. One cowboy with nowhere to belong, and one woman whose entire world had been swept away in a single night. Thorne cleared his throat, unsure he trusted his own voice. Zia did not look at him, but he could see her breath tremble in the cold air. They were strangers bound by storm and death, held together by a silence neither knew how to break. And as the valley stretched wide beneath the lifting sky, Thorne felt the faintest shift inside himself, like a door easing open, letting in a sliver of light he was not yet ready to face. The wind continued to comb the flats long after the storm had passed, scraping across the land as Thorne guided Zia toward the nearest line shack. His horse snorted, uneasy with every gust that rattled the yucca stalks. Puddles along the horizon mirrored the washed-out sky, but the chill clinging to the air warned that night would come down hard and unforgiving. No one survived alone out here, not a cowboy, and certainly not a grieving Apache woman who had lost her horse, her shelter, and her father in a single blow. The shack emerged as a low, crouched shadow against the ridge, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. Thorne pushed the door open, the hinges groaning, and stepped aside to let Zia enter first. Dust rose in a tired sigh as she crossed the threshold. Inside, the place smelled of old timber, forgotten coffee, and the faint echo of men who had passed through in other seasons. Zia paused just inside the doorway, unmoving, her eyes sweeping the room with the caution of someone taught never to assume safety. "You can take the cot," Thorne said quietly. "The floor's dry enough for me." She did not answer. She barely seemed to breathe, only watched him with a stillness that made the room feel smaller. Thorne turned to the stove, striking a match with numb fingers. Sparks caught slowly, coaxing a weak flame to life. The glow softened the harsh angles of the shack, and for a moment even the shadows seemed to retreat. Zia slipped off her soaked blanket and hesitated. "Turn away," she murmured. Thorne did so without a word, listening to the soft pull of wet buckskin peeling from skin. Fabric rustled as water was wrung out. The fire cracked, pushing warmth against his shoulders. Only when she said, "You may look," did he turn back. She was wrapped now in an old wool blanket pulled from a cedar chest, her damp hair darkening the coarse fabric. The blanket engulfed her slight frame, yet her eyes stayed sharp, alert. She kept the small iron talisman clenched in her hand, her thumb tracing its curved edge again and again, as if it anchored her to the moment. Thorne Ashcroft nodded toward the stove. "It'll warm up soon." Her gaze shifted briefly to the flames. "It's enough." Silence settled between them, the kind that pressed inward, heavy against the ears. Thorne lowered himself to the floor near the door, stretching his legs, rubbing his palms together to chase away the cold that still clung to his bones. Zia eased onto the cot but did not lie down. She remained seated, knees drawn close, fingers wrapped tightly around the iron, as though it were the last familiar thing left to her in the world. Thorne cleared his throat, uncertain why the quiet unsettled him enough to break it. "Storms like that don't come often," he said. "We were lucky to find shelter." Her head lifted slightly. "Not luck." "What then?" She paused before answering. "My father used to say the land decides who survives it." Thorne had no reply. He had lived through enough desert nights to suspect she might be right. Another stretch of silence followed, broken only by the low whine of wind slipping through the warped window frame. He found himself studying her face, its angles softened by exhaustion, yet held firm by a resolve he could not fully understand. She was worn down, hollowed by grief, soaked through with loss, but she had not broken. He respected that more than he could put into words. "Back there," he said at last, "when you said you were alone. I'm sorry you had to speak it." Her eyes shifted toward him, unreadable. "The storm took what remained," she said quietly. "I spoke only the truth." He nodded. A tight ache stirred in his chest. "You don't have to say it again tonight." Something flickered across her expression. Surprise, perhaps relief, but it vanished almost as soon as it appeared. She turned her attention back to the fire, letting the light cast long shadows beneath her lashes. Thorne leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes briefly. He could not remember the last time he had shared a room with another soul without feeling cornered. Strangely, Zia's silent presence did not suffocate him. If anything, it held the ghosts at bay. Outside, desert winds circled the shack, rattling loose boards and carrying the distant cries of night birds. Inside, two strangers sat in uneasy calm. Their pasts remained unspoken, their futures uncertain, bound only by the thin walls of the shack and the fragile truce of a night that had thrown them together. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the moment their lives began to bend toward one another. Frost Creek Ranch rose from the valley like a promise, weathered fences, a low barn darkened by years of sun, and a wide porch where Malin Frost often hung laundry that snapped like pale flags in the breeze. By the time Thorne and Zia arrived, the storm clouds had rolled off toward the mountains, leaving behind a washed, almost gentle stillness. The yardhounds barked in greeting, then fell oddly quiet, as if sensing the weight carried by the two rain-soaked figures. Malin stepped out first, hands planted on her hips, flour dusting her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of Zia. Mud-streaked dress, exhaustion carved deep, grief clinging to her like a second skin. Yet Malin's voice carried no fear or judgment, only warmth. "Come inside, child," she said. "A storm like that shouldn't leave anyone standing alone." Garrick Frost appeared behind her, broad-shouldered, beard streaked with silver. He clasped Thorne's arm without asking why he had arrived with a stranger. Thorne had slept in the Frost bunkhouse often enough to know Garrick never asked questions that didn't matter. "There's room," Garrick said simply. "Get her warm." The plainness of their welcome unsettled Zia more than any kindness Thorne had offered. She hesitated a moment too long before stepping inside, her hand lingering on the doorframe, as though crossing it required more than she could afford to give. She would owe them more than she had left. Thorne watched her disappear into the kitchen before carrying his saddle and gear toward the bunkhouse. Still, something tugged at him, an unfamiliar urge to stay close, to be sure she did not vanish the instant he turned away. The days that followed settled over the ranch like fine dust. Zia helped Malin grind corn, mend clothes, and haul water from the well. Her movements were quiet, but steady. Each task deliberate, as though work itself kept her upright when grief threatened to pull her under. Malin spoke to her gently, filling the spaces between words without pressing for more. Slowly, Zia began to respond. Soft yeses, small nods, the rare hint of a smile lifting one corner of her mouth like a ripple across still water. Thorne worked the north pasture alongside Garrick, tightening fence lines battered by the storm. And though he told himself he was focused on the work, his attention kept drifting back toward the house. He told himself he was far too occupied to notice every time Zia stepped out onto the porch to shake crumbs from a cloth or hang bundles of herbs beneath the eaves. Yet his eyes betrayed him again and again, drifting toward the house, following the slope of her shoulders, the fall of her hair, the way she carried her weight with a quiet balance that spoke of a warrior's rest rather than ease. One afternoon, Thorne Ashcroft found her behind the barn, kneeling beside a colt whose back leg quivered with pain. A twisted coil of wire lay half buried in the dust. Zia stroked the colt's neck, murmuring low words in Apache, her voice steady and soothing. The animal, wild with fear, the same one that had fought Garrick Frost all morning, slowly stilled beneath her touch. Thorne approached with care. "He's been kicking at that wire for over an hour," he said quietly. "Didn't let anyone near him." "He's afraid," Zia replied without lifting her eyes. "Fear makes even gentle creatures forget who they are." Her fingers brushed along the colt's flank. Thorne crouched beside her and worked the wire loose with patient hands. When the final bend came free, the colt jolted once, then settled again beneath Zia's palm. Thorne caught himself staring, not at the animal, but at her. At the calm strength etched into her face, at the fierce tenderness she carried, as though it cost her nothing at all. "You've got a gift," he murmured. Zia looked at him then, truly looked, and for a brief moment, Thorne felt as though she saw beyond his skin, past the scars and calloused hands, into the part of him he kept locked tight and unnamed. "It isn't a gift," she said softly. "It is trust." The words lingered between them, warmer than the sun beating down on the barn roof. That evening, Malin Frost asked Zia to carry a mug of coffee out to Thorne on the porch. The sky burned orange as the sun sank behind the mesquite-lined ridges. Thorne sat sharpening his knife when Zia approached. Her steps were light on the boards. She offered the mug without a word. He took it. Their fingers brushed, only for an instant, but something passed between them all the same. Something quiet. Certain. They stood side by side as the sky shifted through shades of gold, then copper, then deep violet. When Zia finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father Koa taught me that people remember everything," she said. "Even what they wish they could forget." Thorne's grip tightened around the mug. He didn't look at her. "Memories don't loosen easy," he said. "Pain even less so." He let out a slow breath. "You're not wrong." Crickets began their evening song, filling the air with a soft, trembling rhythm. A strange ache grew in Thorne's chest, a longing he hadn't felt in years. Not just for company, but for peace, for stillness beside someone who understood the weight of silence. Several days later, as dusk pooled across the valley, Thorne found Zia standing by the fence at the edge of the pasture. The dying light caught in her hair, turning it faintly gold, like a black feather dipped in fire. He stepped up beside her, unsure why his voice tightened when he spoke. "I used to dread evenings like this," he admitted, "back before everything fell apart." She turned her gaze toward him. "Is it the darkness you fear?" she asked, "or what it awakens inside you?" Thorne swallowed. "What it reminds me of." Zia turned fully toward him and lifted her hand, touching the pale scar along his jaw with a feather-light care that stole his breath. "Pain shapes us," she said gently, "but it doesn't have to rule us." Thorne didn't move. That single touch felt like pressure on an old wound, reminding him that healing was still possible. They stood together until the sky deepened into black, and the first stars blinked awake over High Mesquite Valley. No promises were spoken, no confessions given. Yet something had shifted, quietly, surely, like roots finding hold in softened earth. What bound them now was no longer chance or circumstance. It was choice. Fragile, unspoken, beginning to grow. Summer heat rolled into the valley soon after, heavy and unrelenting, the kind that made every board on the ranch creak and every horse flick its tail in irritation. Thorne sensed the change in the air long before the sun dipped low. An instinct sharpened by years of drifting warned him that nothing dangerous ever stayed buried for long, especially when a woman like Zia carried a truth capable of drawing men back from the dead. Eldon Rourke arrived one evening wrapped in dust, his horse lathered and shaking. Thorne saw the look on his face before he spoke, and his stomach tightened. "Valor Crown is back in the valley," Eldon said, swinging down from the saddle, his voice low and urgent. "He's asking about an Apache woman traveling with a lone cowboy. That's all he needs." Thorne swore under his breath. Malin pressed a hand to her apron. Zia stood near the porch steps, still as carved stone. Her fingers curled slowly around the edge of the railing. Thorne stepped toward Eldon. "You're sure it's him?" "As sure as daylight," Eldon replied, his eyes softening. "And if they find her, they won't let her live." The world tilted, not because Thorne doubted the danger, but because the thought of Zia's absence suddenly felt too vast, too final. The darkness felt too familiar, too close to the hollow left inside him the night his own family vanished. A fear older than memory stirred in Thorne Ashcroft, cold and unyielding. He looked at Zia. She met his stare with steady, unblinking calm. "I won't run," she said. "You might have to," Thorne replied, fighting the tremor tightening his chest. "No," she answered. "I am done running." The certainty in her voice shook him. She deserved safety, something better than the restless, uncertain life he had barely survived for years. Yet she stood firm, shoulders squared, like a tree refusing to bend no matter how hard the wind pressed. Eldon Rourke tipped the brim of his hat. "I'll ride for backup," he said. "Keep low tonight." When he disappeared down the road, an uneasy stillness settled over Frost Creek Ranch. Long shadows stretched across the fields as the sky faded from gold into bruised purple. The air grew heavy, as if the valley itself braced for something it could not yet name. Thorne checked every window latch, every door bolt, every rifle. Garrick Frost gathered the Frost Creek hands, speaking in low, urgent tones. Malin Frost tried to draw Zia into the kitchen, but Zia's eyes stayed locked on the darkening ridge beyond the fields. Night crept in. Then came the sound, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, slow, measured, hunting. Thorne felt the blood drain from his face. He stepped onto the porch with his rifle strapped across his chest. Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly revealing 5 riders cresting the ridge like figures carved from stormlight. Valor Crown rode at their head, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a lantern's glow glinting off the knife strapped across his chest. "Get inside," Thorne said to Zia, sharper than he meant. She didn't move. "I stay." Rain began tapping against the porch roof as Thorne turned to her. "Zia." "I stay," she repeated, quieter this time, but unyielding. "You told me I didn't have to speak my truth again. I won't run from it either." He wanted to argue, to pull her inside, bolt the door, shield her from the world. But the resolve in her eyes was stronger than any storm he had ever ridden through. Thunder rolled across the valley as Valor Crown and the Black Hollow Men advanced. Lantern lights streaked across the wet ground like lines of fire. Thorne moved down the steps, positioning himself between the barn and the house, where he could see every shadow. "Come out easy, cowboy," Valor called, his voice sliding across the yard like a familiar threat. "We're looking for the Apache woman. Hand her over, and we'll be gone." Lightning split the sky. Rain began to fall hard. "You'll get her over my dead body," Thorne said without hesitation. Silence followed. Then Valor's laughter burst through the night. "That can be arranged." Gunfire erupted, sharp, violent, echoing across the valley. Thorne fired back, pressing against the corral fence as bullets tore splinters from the wood beside his head. Garrick and the Frost Creek hands held their line at the barn, answering shot for shot with grim resolve. The storm broke in full force. Rain slashed sideways, turning the world into streaks of silver and shadow. Through the chaos, Thorne spotted Valor slipping toward the house, using smoke and rain for cover. Thorne knew his target, the kitchen window, where Zia would be with Malin. "No," Thorne breathed, and ran. Mud sucked at his boots as thunder swallowed his breath. He rounded the corner just as Valor smashed through the window frame, glass exploding outward. Zia gasped and stumbled back. Thorne tackled Valor, driving him into the mud. They rolled, fists and boots striking hard, breath ripping from their lungs as the storm howled overhead. Valor's knife flashed. Thorne seized his wrist, but the blade crept closer. Closer. Cold steel grazed Thorne's throat, one breath away from ending everything. "I should have finished you on the trail," Valor snarled. Thorne's grip slipped. Mud slicked his hands. The knife pressed harder. Then thunder answered thunder. A gunshot tore through the night. Valor jerked, eyes wide. Blood bloomed across his chest as he collapsed into the waterlogged dirt. Thorne staggered back, breath ragged. Zia stood framed in the shattered window, both hands trembling around a smoking shotgun. Rain plastered her hair to her face, but her eyes never left Thorne. For a long moment, the storm fell silent in his ears. There was only her, alive, fierce, unbroken. "I thought I'd lost you," Thorne said, the words tearing free from someplace deep inside him. The words tore loose from a place inside Thorne Ashcroft that no one had touched in years. Zia lowered the gun slowly. "You are not lost," she whispered. "Not to me." Around them, the fight unraveled. The Black Hollow men melted back into the darkness. Garrick Frost shouted something victorious, but Thorne heard none of it. His entire world narrowed to Zia, standing amid shattered glass and rain. She had chosen him when it mattered most. And somewhere between fear, blood, and storm, Thorne realized he was no longer running. He finally had someone, and somewhere, worth staying for. The rain thinned into a drifting mist. By the time the last echoes of gunfire faded across high Mesquite Valley, the barn smoldered along its edges. The ground lay torn and dark, where boots had slipped and bullets had struck. But the danger had passed. What remained was breath, uneven, fragile, alive. Thorne sat on an overturned water trough near the well, mud streaking his shirt, blood, mostly not his, drying against his skin. The cut along his shoulder pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He didn't care. Pain was small tonight. He had known worse. Zia approached carrying a basin of warm water Malin Frost had hurried to heat. Her steps were slow, measured, as if she feared Thorne might vanish if she reached him too quickly. The storm's sharp scent lingered in her hair. Lantern light behind her cast flickering shadows across her face, softening the trembling resolve etched there. "Sit still," she murmured. Thorne didn't argue. He watched her kneel before him, watched her dip the cloth into the water, wring it out with care, as though the steadiness of her hands held the world together. When she pressed the cloth to his shoulder, warmth spread through the ache. "You saved my life," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You risked yours for mine. That matters." She met his gaze. "No, it is the same." The cloth stilled against his skin. Thorne felt the full weight of her eyes, dark, steady, unflinching. Something inside him shifted, realigned, as if he were finally being seen in a way he hadn't been since boyhood. "You could have run," he whispered. "No one would have blamed you." Zia dipped the cloth again, her reflection trembling in the water. "My father, Koa, said iron must meet fire before it becomes strong." She wrung out the cloth without looking at him. "I have met my fire. Running would not have saved me." Thorne exhaled, the breath shaking loose from deep within his chest. "I keep thinking about that night," he said. "The night my family was taken. I spent years believing if I stayed still too long, the dark would swallow me next." Zia rose and sat beside him on the trough. She didn't take his hand, only let her arm brush against his. The touch was so gentle it struck harder than any blow. "You survived the dark," she said softly, "but you never learned how to rest in the light." His throat tightened. "You lost everything in one night. How are you still standing?" Zia looked toward the hills where the storm had retreated. "Because falling apart would leave me with nothing left to protect." She turned back to him. "I still carry my father's teachings. I have the land. I have breath." Her voice wavered then, just enough to reveal the wound beneath. "And I have the choice not to be alone anymore." Thorne's breath caught. The desert fell impossibly still, as if the land itself were listening. He forced his voice steady. "If you stay here a while, no one at Frost Creek will turn you away. Malin would fight off an army first." Zia studied him, her expression softening at the edges. "And you?" she asked. "Would you want me to stay?" Thorne swallowed. Words had never come easy, especially the ones that mattered. "I don't remember the last time I wanted anyone to stay," he said at last. Silence followed, deep and tender. Then Zia did something she had not done since the moment they met. She reached for his hand. Her fingers slid into his with quiet certainty, rough palm against rough palm. Two lives marked by loss, finding a single point of rest. "You are not lost, Thorne Ashcroft," she whispered. "Not anymore." Thorne Ashcroft tightened his fingers around Zia's, feeling the truth of her words settle deep into his bones, warm and steady, like heat returning after a long, unforgiving winter. For the first time in years, High Mesquite Valley felt full instead of hollow. The night no longer pressed in with threat. Even the shadows seemed to offer shelter rather than danger. Behind them, the ranch hummed with quiet urgency, low voices, the clank of buckets, the distant calls of Garrick Frost and the Frost Creek hands repairing what the fight had torn apart. But here, beside the well beneath the lantern's gentle glow, Thorne and Zia existed in a smaller world, held together by breath, by touch, by something neither of them was ready to name aloud. And though the last storm clouds drifted away into the dark, something new took root in the softened ground beneath their feet. Autumn arrived quietly in High Mesquite Valley. The air cooled. Mesquite leaves curled and crisped along their edges. The scars left at Frost Creek faded beneath fresh boards and newly set fence posts. Yet for Thorne and Zia, the deeper healing had begun long before the ranch stood whole again. Thorne worked from first light until moonrise, hauling timber, stacking stone, fixing tools, taking every task Garrick offered and finding more among nearby homesteads. He saved every dollar, every coin, refusing even a drink until he had enough to purchase a forgotten cabin near a dry creek bed. The place leaned crooked and half-lost beneath weeds. Its roof held fewer shingles than gaps. But when Thorne looked at it, he saw possibility, not ruin. When he brought Zia to see it, fingers nervous beneath the brim of his hat, she smiled in a way that loosened something tight in his chest. They rebuilt it together. Zia cleared brush from the walls, her hands steady as she cut away dead roots choking the foundation. Thorne repaired the roof, his hammer ringing across the empty creek bed like a promise taking form. Some days, Malin Frost sent the Frost Creek hands to help. Other days, Zia worked alone while Thorne rode out for supplies. Days stacked upon days. Slowly, the cabin became a home. Boards straightened, porch reinforced, windows cleaned until desert sunlight poured through, warming the space within. One morning, as the final repairs neared completion, Zia hung a strand of turquoise beads above the doorway. The stones shimmered pale blue, swaying gently with each breeze. Thorne stood beside her, watching them move. "What does it mean?" he asked. She touched one stone softly. "Protection, memory, and a promise," she said. "A home should be built with intention, not by accident." The truth of it settled deep inside him. "Does it feel like home to you?" Her eyes softened. "It could." That was more than enough. Weeks later, when everything stood ready, Thorne saddled his horse and asked Zia to ride with him to her father's resting place. The morning air was crisp. The sky stretched wide and blue, hard as hammered steel. They followed Red Wash Road until the creek curved into a quiet hollow, where wild sunflowers still clung stubbornly to the season. The stone mound remained just as they had left it. Weathered, but unbroken. Zia knelt first, brushing fallen leaves from the ground. Thorne stood beside her, holding a canvas-wrapped bundle. When he unrolled it, Zia drew a quiet breath. The iron talisman had been reshaped, no longer the bent, broken hook she carried on the storm night they met, but a smooth, forged crescent, whole beneath the sun. Thorne had spent weeks learning from a local blacksmith, burning his hands more times than he cared to admit, until he could shape the metal into something that carried both memory and renewal. "It's the same iron," Thorne said quietly. "Just given another chance?" Zia's fingers trembled as she touched it. She whispered a soft Apache prayer, rhythmic, rising like smoke, part farewell, part gratitude. When she stood, Thorne took her hand. There was no hesitation now, no fear. "This land," he said, nodding toward the valley, the waiting cabin, the sunlight warming the stones. "It's ours, if you want it to be." Zia turned to him. Her eyes, once shadowed by grief, now held the calm strength of someone who had walked through fire and emerged shaped, but unbroken. She lifted his hand to her cheek. "We are forged, Thorne Ashcroft," she said. "You and I." The words settled between them like the final strike of a hammer, sealing metal to metal. Wind stirred the mesquite leaves, carrying the scent of dry earth and a future untouched by fear. Below them, the dry creek shimmered in the early light. On its bank stood their cabin, a thin ribbon of smoke curling steadily from the chimney. As they rode back toward it, the valley opened before them. Not harsh, not empty, not something to outrun, but a home, chosen, built with courage, and filled with a love born from storm and fire. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you, truly. Aviso legal, disclaimer. All stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.